Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Scandal Mongers with me, just me, solo Phil, launching further forward in the career as the lone podcaster. Lots to talk about today. So many things are happening. I can hardly keep up. And I've actually interrupted my little holiday in Wales. Do you want to see where I am? See if I can do this. Beautiful rural Wales. It's Craig's gone for a walk. Can you see that? Beautiful hillside. Yeah, it was pouring with rain for most of yesterday, to be honest. But then again, what do you expect? Wales in September. My plug's fallen out of my laptop. Need to find that. Oh dear, the production quality is collapsing. There we are. Yeah, oh, what a week. So I wanted to talk about that Kate video, because I found it very, very moving. I'm sure everybody has seen it. And both as somebody who's interested in the story of what's happening with Kate, but also as somebody who's spent 40 years working in television. It's a very interesting approach, very unusual. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite so intimate, quite so personal from a member of the royal family for a very long time. Even Diana, who was sort of famously open about her feelings, didn't do anything quite like this, I don't think. Wasn't universally popular, actually. I'm slightly surprised, even in places where the royal family is usually praised. The Daily Mail, well, the Daily Mail kind of tends to play all sides against the middle, let's be honest. Liz Jones, one of the columnists, was quite aggressively hostile to it. So why wasn't she meeting women with a cancer diagnosis? Why wasn't she doing public service, basically? What is this kind of, Hollywood schmaltz? The public will see through this. It's a bit strange, a bit desperate, Liz said. How can we take William seriously, she wrote. Now we see him wrapping his bare legs round his wife. This stretches our credulity. It's manipulative. It's over-emotional. I don't know. I mean, I think using modern techniques to connect with the audience, in this case, the audience is the people of the world who care about this family, and especially the people of Britain, for whom they are the ruling family, I think it's entirely justified. And I think there's an obvious comparison to be made with some of the things we've seen from the rival royal camp. People will know I'm rather more sympathetic to Harry and Meghan than some, especially when it comes to the press and Harry's crusade against the tabloids over phone hacking. But I mean, I was always very clear that Netflix series was very manipulative. There's an example, I'd say, of using, very classy modern editing techniques and music to create a really kind of false impression of their own story, but also of the country that they'd fled from. It was using TV techniques in the service of, well, I'd say sort of slander, really, a misrepresentation that was very successful, actually. And it was presented modern Britain as a kind of racist hellhole. It was full of knuckle-dragging xenophobes who'd driven this family out. And it did it on the basis of some really selective editing and tiny, tiny pieces of evidence blown up into something massive. And I think compared to that, what Catherine did was really lovely. And I think we also need to remember that many of us will have had our lives touched by cancer. It's such an important, desperately serious problem in our lives. I think in Britain, it's something like 3.5 million at any one time are living with cancer. That's like 5% of the population. And there are so many others who care for people with cancer, who treat people with cancer, or connected to this terrible disease. And she's becoming a spokesperson for this. And I think that's tremendous that she's doing that. And seeing that she's still hugging her children and that they're all kind of enjoying ordinary things of life, like playing on the beach. It's optimistic. It's encouraging. I think a lot of people have taken a lot of hope from it. It's service, not self-pity, which I think maybe defines some of the media from the rival camp. It's service. So I was rather impressed, as you've probably gathered. It made me think a bit about my own republicanism, because I used to be quite a serious Republican. When I lived in Australia, I was a member of the Australian Republican group. And I still think for Australia, it probably makes sense to have a head of state who isn't born on the other side of the world. If you're a self-confident, independent country and a very diverse country, why would you want some British aristocrat to be your head of state? But in terms of Britain, I think I have changed. I wrote about this. I put the article in the bio when the Queen died. I talked about a name dropping, but he was a friend of mine. Christopher Hitchens was a mate, and we talked a lot about this. And I interviewed him actually for my Diana biography, and he was very anti. He just thought it was all kind of show, a kind of trick played upon the masses. And I felt that there was more to it than that. And actually, he himself directed me to a really interesting article that I put in this column that I'll link to, which is, it's not just about a trick being played upon the people. It's about a need of the people. The idea of having an emblematic family that is above politics. I mean, it hasn't always been, let's be honest, but it kind of is now. And their life, their family life, their marriages, their deaths, their divorces, their children, we can all share in it. And it has a kind of healing effect and an inspiring effect. And I've come to believe that. Whereas perhaps once I would have been more with Hitchens. He was not an easy man to disagree with, but he always loved a good debate. There's a reflection of that, both in my book, Diana's Story of a Princess, and in the article that I'll put on the bio. Anyway, it makes you think. I think those sort of very powerful pieces of personal testimony always make you think. And that's what this one made me think. You don't expect people to agree, and if you're not interested in these little rants at the beginning of the show, you can always skip to the interview. And what an interview it is! You really will enjoy it, I think. It contains so many of the things that we love on this podcast: massive characters, sexual scandal, outrageous drunkenness, big characters, a turning point in history, and the Second World War. And Giles is a great storyteller. I'm so pleased he's in great demand at the moment. It's because he's one of Britain's most successful writers, and he's chosen to come on our little podcast to chat with me about his book, and I think you will love it. But before we get to that, I just wanted to do a bit of housekeeping. I love to just inform people how we're doing, and we're doing well in the charts again. That last show was in the charts, which really pleased me. It wasn't perhaps the most highly rated on YouTube, but I think it did pretty well on Apple because it popped up in New Zealand, Argentina, and Ireland in the Apple charts, and in Anguilla again. And I reckon there's one person in Anguilla who listens. If it's you, please be in touch. I'd love to know what you think. I've also got into the wonderful world of Guidle. I sometimes call it Geedle, but I think it's Guidle. It's a brilliant new app that my friend Rob Lyman, who's a historian, has started with some other people. And it's like a location-based history talk app. So wherever you are in the world, it's mostly Britain now, but it's going to expand, I think. You'll see little kind of logos popping up on the app, and you can click on it, and you'll find somebody like me, or somebody even better than me, a real expert in something, talking about the place and the people from that place and why that story means something to them. It's really cool. I've done a couple. I've done one on Nelson and Trafalgar, linked to Portsmouth. So I wrote a book about that a few years ago. And I've done one about the Battle of Britain and the Air Force Memorial, linked to the site of where the Magna Carta was signed, actually, which is where this memorial is, just outside London. And I've just started one on Diana. I've just done the very first one. I'm going to do more because it's such a big story. I'll do 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. I've just done her childhood. I'll be sort of following her around the world, little stories that are relevant to that place in her life. Anyway, if you like it, give it a try. If you think it's interesting, I should say, give it a try. Love the feedback. Always love the feedback. Keep it coming. The engagement is so important to we podcasters, as you know. R.A. Rahosh 3 thought the last show was wonderful. Thank you very much. What a great conversation between the two of you. All about Coco Chanel, in case you haven't seen it. It's really cool, with the lovely Anne de Courcy. And as Roche 3 points out, during World War II, many people did things they wouldn't consider ordinary and had to make choices they wouldn't normally have to make. And that was particularly true of women who were very exposed in an occupied country. So she wasn't going to judge Coco for what she did. Catherine Hills, 1418, had more on that wonderful detail about one of Coco's lovers, who was actually, according to Catherine Hills, his full name was, he was a Grand Duke. He was called Felix Yusupov. And he actually was one of the men who killed Rasputin before he went on to have his love affair and with Coco Chanel and help her get her career going. Incredible characters in her story. And then, of course, the really important thing, black pudding. If you've not followed this, you should. It's a big hot subject. popped up when I shared a picture with Shauna from the Vintage Read, and about half the comments on her interview with me were about black pudding. Well, of course they were. And many people saying, oh my God, it's disgusting. How could you, Phil? Lots of little vomiting emojis, and other people proclaiming it as a great delicacy, and other similar things that you all eat around the world. Liz Altieri, good black pudding is delicious, and a fully cooked breakfast, including black pudding, is the best start of the day. Isn't that nice? Probably the worst problem, we're getting into dietary fashions now. The worst problem in the world is putting sugar in breakfasts, especially baked bean sauce. Avoid the baked beans, Phil, but have a hearty breakfast. There we are. Oh, and she loved talking about cocoa, Chanel, but mostly black pudding. No, thanks for all that and for all the comments and the feedback. Much appreciated. I'll have more info at the end of the interview with Giles about what's coming up soon. And spoiler alert, it's a lot. But thanks for sticking with me. Really enjoying doing this by myself. Training wheels are off. Having a good time. Let's go talk to Giles. Thanks. Bye. Well, welcome, Giles, who is joining us from some beautiful rural corner of Europe, I believe.
I am indeed. I'm in sunny Burgundy. It's been absolutely lovely here, but unfortunately, all good things come to an end. I'm coming back to London in a few days.
Well, there's some nice drizzly rain out there to welcome you. There you can see through my window. Well, look, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the show again. I so enjoyed the book. I really thought it was a hoot. And, you know, I'm currently trying to write a book myself about the end of the war, mixing all the political and the personal. But you've shown really how it can be done so very well. I did particularly like the line where you say that your first draft was vodka with Stalin.
Vodka has its own entry in the index of this book. That shows you how important it is.
But you've got this amazing cast of characters that really kind of showed what human drama and effort was necessary to keep this really, really important show on the road. I guess I wanted to ask you really, who selected these people that form your main witnesses?
Yeah, so just a bit of background. What I wanted to do is give, if you like, a peek from behind the curtains on some of the greatest and most dramatic moments of World War II, and particularly the moments where the big three, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, find themselves in the same room together. And their relationship was always fractious. It was not a comfortable one. They were not natural allies. None of the three of them were natural allies. And so what they needed was a team of people to manage this relationship and essentially keep it on track. And so they picked people who didn't necessarily have any experience of diplomacy, but they were very good sort of people managers, if you like. And so the key American was Averell Harriman, who was picked by Roosevelt to come first to London and then ultimately to Moscow to work alongside Stalin. Averell Harriman was no diplomat. He had no experience whatsoever of diplomacy. He was a multimillionaire business tycoon who owned the Union Pacific Railway, good friend of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt saw in Averell somebody who was extremely good at managing people. And so he was given the pretty big task of managing Joseph Stalin. The key British person who was managing this relationship was a diplomat. He was called Archie Clark Kerr. But he was a very different diplomat from all others. You know, if you picture a diplomat from the 1940s, you know, you'd see a man in a pinstripe suit, bowler hat, rolled umbrella, black briefcase, you know, strolling down Whitehall. Archie was very, very different. He held his meetings in shorts, in a deck chair in the embassy garden in the summer. He wrote all his letters with a quill pen, which his memos to the Foreign Office with a quill pen, which necessitated having a flock of geese in the British embassy in Moscow.
Oh, how extraordinary.
So he'd pluck out feathers to, you know, when he needed a new quill. And, you know, this was the age when ambassadors were called Your Excellency, not Archie. He insisted that everyone called him Archie. And this was, I think, a key. This openness was a key to how he was able to form a really close relationship, I'd say friendship, with Stalin, which was to prove incredibly important when him and Averell are tasked with keeping this alliance, this relationship on track.
And Averell Harriman's daughter, Kathy, becomes one of your main witnesses. It must have been an absolute thrill to come across all of her letters, because they just don't feel like they're written in that century.
I know it's extraordinary. So just to give some background, Kathy, as you say, Averell's daughter, 23 years old, glamorous American socialite, rich, highly educated, extremely intelligent, and very confident. And she was sent first to Britain to work with her father alongside Churchill. So they were in and out of Downing Street. They were in and out of Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. They spent all their waking hours with Churchill. And then a couple of years later, they would do the same in Moscow, living alongside Joseph Stalin in the Kremlin. And Kathy wrote hundreds of letters home to her sister, describing absolutely what life was like to be almost at the epicenter of the war. When you're living at Chequers and the news is coming in all the time from all over the world of disasters, of catastrophes, of battles that are being won and lost. And she's recording all this. And because her letters go by the diplomatic bag, she could write whatever she wanted and it wasn't going to get censored. So I learned of these letters existing in New York. I contacted the family, in fact, her son, David Mortimer, who said, come over to New York. I've got boxes of this stuff,
Wow.
And so I came over and, it is fly on the wall stuff. That's what's so great. So
and who is reading these letters? Are they going to the State Department, or are they going to the White House, or just friends of hers?
All of them. They're all going to 90% of them are going to her sister in New York. So she's writing their personal letters. So they're detailing not only the big events of the war, but all the gossip that's going on in the background, which of course I love all those juicy bits. You have a unique perspective on events of great, a moment, such as the attack on Pearl Harbor. She's at Chequers the night when Churchill flips on the 9 o'clock news. Churchill, incidentally, he's been hungover all day. He drank far too much alcohol the night before. He's been sitting all day with his head in his hands. And then he puts on the 9 o'clock news and they learn that the Japanese have attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor. And it's fantastic to read this letter because you're reading it almost in real time as events were unfolding, that, Churchill suddenly leaps up from his armchair and shouts to the room, we're going to declare war on Japan. And then he rushes out, he rings President Roosevelt they have a hotline, and they discuss what they're going to do next. And she's listening to all this and putting it into her letter to her sister. So stuff like that, for me as a historian, it's just priceless stuff.
Well, she also forms a very close friendship with Churchill's daughter-in-law, Pamela, even though she knows that Pamela's having an affair with her own father, which is very modern.
This is very modern. I mean, Averell Harriman was annoyingly good looking and very charismatic. And you've got to take your hat off to the chutzpah of the man. Within a week of arriving in Great Britain from America, he's in bed with Pamela Churchill, which is Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law, married to Randolph. Now, Randolph, the disastrous, dissolute drunkard, has been sent off to war. So Pamela's on her own. She's living in Churchill with the Churchill family. This suave, good-looking multimillionaire, many years older than her, drifts in. She just says he's the most gloriously good-looking man I've ever met. And he's determined to get into his bed, which she achieves within a couple of weeks. And as you say, Kathy, Averell's daughter, has formed a very close friendship with Pamela, knows that she's sleeping with her father, and yet it's never mentioned. It's this extraordinary sort of, I think it's a period of great discretion, that these things were known about, but they weren't talked about. They only ever mention it elliptically once. And even then, the subject is dropped very soon.
Was there ever a suggestion that Churchill himself encouraged this? I mean, it was quite valuable, I'm sure, to have somebody close to you, very close to Harriman, given how close he was to Roosevelt.
Yeah, I was always wondering, did they realize, the Churchills, Winston and Clementine, did they realize what was taking place in their own house, And actually what happened, we know the answer to that, because what happened many, many years later, Averell and Pamela had drifted apart and they got back together when they were both single. And this is in the 70s, so many decades later. And eventually they get married. And Pamela writes to Clementine and says, I'm getting married to Averell Harriman. And she's always wondered if they knew about that they were having an affair. And Clementine writes back, and she, with one lovely little phrase, she says, my, an old relationship rekindled. So clearly, Winston and Clementine knew all along what was taking place. And perhaps, as you say, this was, not unuseful to them to have Roosevelt's personal representative in bed, literally, with one of the Churchills.
I remember working on a project about 1942, and I got to go through a cardboard box myself, Harry Hopkins material. And I came across some of those beautiful printed cards people used to use to communicate in those days. And there were several from Pamela to Harry Hopkins. This would be in early 1942, spring. And the first one was simply, I would very much appreciate a phone call when you land. Fair enough. The next one from a few days later said, I'm going to paraphrase it, but this is pretty much exactly what it said. So wonderful to see you the other night. I hope you have a lot of fun chasing girls down the corridors at the Savoy. But as you know, some of us quite like to be caught. That's what she wrote to Hopkins. Now, I have no idea if they ever had an affair, but clearly she was kind of open to flirtation like that with powerful visiting Americans.
And Pamela, of course, post-war would have a string of lovers, all of them extremely rich, and string of affairs that went on and on for many decades. And it was, as I say, it was only in the 70s when she re-met Averell Harriman, and ultimately they would get married. And of course, Pamela would go on to have a pretty lofty position. She'd become Clinton's American ambassador to Paris. So she played a fairly significant role in international events.
So this soap opera then kind of moves to Moscow when the Soviets joined the war and then the Americans joined the war. And as you say, all of these massive summits and clashing agendas and personality. I mean, Churchill and Stalin were ideological opponents for decades beforehand. And these guys who are your main witnesses kind of try and make this relationship work. What was the moment, you think, when everything kind of clicked and people could relax? Yes, we are going to have a three-way alliance. We might not always like each other, but we can now kind of go forward and form a plan to try and win the war.
Well, I think it's more complicated because this alliance, this relationship, this partnership, if you like, was constantly on the cusp of falling apart. And that's why these players were so important. So to give one great moment of crisis was in the summer of 1942, when Churchill flies to Moscow to meet Stalin face to face for the first time. As you say, he has detested Stalin and everything he stands for his entire political career. And it's in a moment of great sort of pragmatism, if you like, that when Churchill is brought news of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, he realizes that it's in Britain's best interest to get into bed with Joseph Stalin, because both Britain and the Soviet Union are under attack from Hitler. But it's always going to be a problematic relationship. So he flies to Moscow in the summer of 1942. He meets with Stalin in the Kremlin, and on the very first night, the meeting is an absolute disaster. Stalin is in a foul mood. He insults Winston Churchill. He brings up things like the Gallipoli campaign from the First World War, which of course was,
always touchy subject.
Always a touchy subject with Winston Churchill. And he said it failed because of stupidities in planning and execution. So this is a sort of barbed comment that's going, it's like shoving a dagger straight into Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill is absolutely furious. And he leaves the Kremlin that night. He goes back to the dacha where he's staying, and he tells his aides, I'm going home. I'm ripping up this alliance. I'm having nothing more to do with this monster in the Kremlin. And Churchill means it. And all his aides are trying to talk him out of it, because this is a complete catastrophe if the wartime alliance falls apart so early, in this period in 1942. Desperate times, really. So they all fail to talk Churchill out of it. He's going to fly back on the next morning. And this is where Archie Clark Kerr comes to the fore. Archie is an old friend of Churchill. They get on really well. Churchill really respects him. And Archie is a brilliant person at understanding personality and characters. And he understands Churchill's strengths, but also his weaknesses. And he takes Churchill for a walk. And it's the most extraordinary and clever conversation of a diplomat to a senior leader, where he persuades Churchill to go back into the Kremlin for one more meeting with Stalin, just him, Stalin, and an interpreter. and Churchill gruffly obeys this this sort of edict from Archie, goes back into the Kremlin. He gets completely drunk with Stalin. They form a bizarre sort of friendship, and all is well. The wartime alliance is back on track, and this happens on countless occasions during the war. And it makes you realize that these guys working behind the scenes, they are absolutely vital to keeping this alliance on track.
Thinking a little later in the war, when various, how can we put it? There are mixed messages about where the Allies are going. And of course, discussions are starting about spheres of influence in the post-war world. And I think it's at Yalta, which is quite late, of course, that there's another huge row between Churchill and Stalin about Greece. Because Churchill thinks he's had a deal with Stalin over some drunken conversation. And I'm looking into this story myself, and Stalin says, well, you know, you're behaving like terrible imperialists, killing all these Greek communists. It's not right. And Churchill flies into a huge rage. But what I didn't know, what I discovered from your book, is that I think even before that conversation, there'd been another amazing private chat and something called the naughty document. So I'd love you to tell me more about that.
This is a great one. To give it a little, just a brief background, you've got to remember that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, they're all competing against each other. And particularly, there's a very fractious relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. Roosevelt, sort of anti-imperialist, detests the British Empire, and therefore sort of detests everything that Churchill stands for. And so they're competing, if you like, for the affections of Stalin. It's completely bizarre. And so what happens is they constantly want to meet Stalin on their own without the third one there. And Churchill achieves this in 1944 when he goes back to Moscow. And as you say, he produces in this tete-a-tete with Joseph Stalin what he himself calls his naughty document. And by golly, it is naughty, because what he's proposing is they carve up sort of Eastern and Central Europe between the two of them. And Stalin, he says, you can have like most of Romania and Bulgaria and those countries. We're not that interested in those, but I'm interested in Greece. So we want to have like a controlling stake in Greece. And this, he actually says to Stalin, you know, we mustn't let people know about this document, because they'd find it quite cynical to realize that the two of us had just carved up Europe. Now, of course, it comes to Averell Harriman's attention, and he's absolutely appalled by what Churchill is proposing. He says, I cannot really understand what he's trying to achieve, you know, by doing this document. But it was, you know, and it came to, really, the whole story came to light because Archie, the ambassador, had persuaded the interpreter to write down everything that happened at that meeting. And so we have a sort of verbatim account, again, of something that we were never meant to know about. You know, this was all top secret, but those flies on the wall, they're keeping little notes of what's taking place, and happily those still exist. So we can piece together this extraordinary piece of history.
I mean, you know, a few years later, Churchill will coin the phrase Iron Curtain and complain about what's happening in Eastern Europe. But it seems to me that he kind of almost helped draw that curtain, that he was not exactly happy, because of course that also meant the Poles were likely to be sacrificed. But, you know, he's an old 19th century, you know, realpolitik. Now let's scramble for Africa. You can have this bit, we'll have that bit. So, yeah, you know, these private conversations kind of created the Cold War, didn't they?
They did, in a way, but the added complication, I think, was if you just fast forward just a few months. You mentioned the Yalta Conference, where, you know, this was the great conference where the big three were really sat down and made themselves architects of the post-war world. So they're going to decide essentially who gets what. The problem with Yalta, and it should be said that everyone comes out of Yalta feeling really good about themselves, you know, that they've planned that this alliance that's on the cusp of winning the war against Hitler is going to continue into the post-war world. The problem is that Stalin wants control of Poland, of the Baltic states, of Eastern and much of Central Europe. And by this point, you know, we're talking about January, February 1945, the Red Army is almost in possession of most of these places. So the problem is, whatever they've decided on paper, Stalin is pretty much about to get everything that he wants anyway. And it's going to be extraordinarily hard for Roosevelt and Churchill to sort of actually say, well, actually, we want Poland, we want a democratic Poland, we want Germany X to be done with Germany, etc.
And given that we'd actually gone to war, in defense of Poland. I mean, that was the casus belli. It was a dark time, I think, and there was a lot of sadness in London, but they probably felt they couldn't do much about it because, as you say, so the Soviets were there. I think at this point, the British and the Americans are still on the wrong side of the Rhine. So it's looking pretty bleak.
It's very interesting that, you know, Churchill's known for these lofty speeches and everything he makes. And he makes this lofty speech to Stalin saying, you know, for me, it's inconceivable that Poland isn't democratic. At the end of the war, like you say, we went to war over Poland. It's a question of honor for me, he says. And Stalin just turns to him and says, for me, it's a question of survival. And Stalin always has this ability, even with Winston Churchill, to cut him dead with a fairly ruthless, barbed comment, you know. And yeah, so it's fascinating to read those accounts.
I get the impression you like Stalin a bit more than perhaps you should. I mean, or maybe you can't help it because he's kind of the winner in this game, isn't he?
Well, I don't like him, but what I found extremely interesting in all the accounts I read of the people who are working for Churchill and Roosevelt in Moscow, so they're working very closely with Joseph Stalin, is that they all come at the end of the war, they sort of write reports on what they thought of the Big Three relationship and analysing the Big Three as players in the war. And they all came to the same conclusion that while they detested Stalin and while they knew he was a mass murderer who'd liquidated millions of his own people, they all said that he was the most effective of the three wartime leaders in getting what he wanted. And so they came away with this a sort of almost sickening admiration for him and the way he manipulated everything to his own advantage.
So interesting. So the kind of soap opera side of it, the relationships, the affairs, the late night drinking, does that carry on in Moscow too? Or are people a little bit better behaved?
Oh my God, I think they're worse behaved in Moscow. I mean, the drinking is absolutely extraordinary. And drunkenness is seen as one way on both sides. Everyone's using drunkenness as a way of getting information out of people. So, you know, the Americans and British will try and get Stalin's commissars drunk to get information out of them. Kathy, of course, plays a key role in this because she's the American embassy hostess. So she's the hostess of all these parties, these glittering affairs. I mean, this is like, it's almost like stepping back into Tsarist Russia. These parties are being held in mansions with chandeliers and candles burning and you know, white tablecloths and bowls of fruit and, you know, tons and tons of alcohol. These parties that Kathy is hostessing are never innocent. They're always there. There's always a purpose behind them, and that's to get out information, because what Kathy, Avril, and indeed Archie are trying to find out are Stalin's plans for the post-war world. Even in 1942, 1943, they're trying to work out what Stalin is intending to do. And so, yes, a lot of parties, a lot of drunkenness. And of course, Stalin as well hosts one of the most infamous banquets, if you like, where the goal was really to get Avril, Kathy, and Archie as drunk as they possibly could. So there's this incredible drinking bout goes on. And this is an extraordinary moment, actually, in the Second World War, from the Russian point of view, where Stalin hosts this banquet, which literally is the most glamorous and most opulent banquet that's been held since Tsarist times. And the dress code is white tie, and all the diplomats, they can't quite believe it, because they're all coming to, you know, communist Russia. None of them have brought their, you know, tails and white tie and all that, because they thought we're not going to need them here. Only Archie managed to sort of scrabble together this fabulous, you know, costume. So he turns out in all his sort of imperial splendor at this banquet. He gets completely drunk, and at midnight he rises to his feet to give one last toast to Joseph Stalin and, you know, great wartime leader and all that. And he is so drunk that he teeters on his feet and then crashes down on the table in front of him. The table collapses to the floor. Everything smashes to the floor, and Archie ends up with his head in some sort of broken bowl on the floor and has to be carted off home. And there's just a wonderful postscript to this story. In the morning, he wakes up in his bedroom and he's lying on the floor with his head in the fire grate and his butler in a leather armchair. And when the footman walks in, he says to the footman, "Why am I lying on the floor with my head in the grate? And why is my butler sleeping in the leather armchair?" And his footman said, "Because, sir, that's exactly how you wanted it."
Brilliant. There's so many great stories like this in the book, so I really do recommend it. I was thinking a little bit about Roosevelt, though, because there's a conventional wisdom that Roosevelt's getting quite frail. You know, Stalin is outmaneuvering him. especially towards the end. I'm not sure if that's true because, of course, what people often don't write about is that Stalin gives Roosevelt something really, really important, which is the promise to go to war with Japan. Which,
Yes.
leaving aside imperialism and Britain and his relationship with Churchill, Roosevelt doesn't know he's going to get an atom bomb at this point. He knows he
No.
might do, but he's terrified of the casualty projections that have been given to him by his generals. So Stalin actually does do something quite big for Roosevelt at the end. So I'm not sure Roosevelt is a dupe at all, or do you disagree?
Roosevelt, I had a really, when I first started this book, I had a fairly sort of ambivalent attitude to Roosevelt. And the more I read about him, the more I found him rather an unpleasant individual, actually, constantly putting down Churchill, constantly trying to, curry favor with Stalin. And from what I read, Stalin never really respected Churchill, but he did respect Roosevelt because he respected the industrial might of America, which is, of course, represented in the president. And let's not forget, millions and millions of tons of American equipment, jeeps, tanks, planes are pouring into the Soviet Union, without which, would Russia have been victorious on the Eastern Front? Certainly, the war might have gone on another 2 years on the Eastern Front had it not been for all this American equipment. So I think that Stalin had a genuine respect for Roosevelt. And like you say, Roosevelt did get that big bonus, not just Stalin coming in coming in on the war against Japan, which was incredibly important. The number of American lives which were being lost in 1945 was quite considerable. And also, the other success that Roosevelt scored was to get Stalin to sign up to the nascent United Nations. This was going to be the global policeman in the post-war world. And there was a constant doubt as to whether the Soviet Union would be part of this. And Roosevelt saw this as absolutely vital, that it's sort of bringing the Soviet Union into the sphere of international law and order. So it was vitally important, and Stalin did sign up to that. One thing I would add is you said about was he weak and feeble and sick and ill and everything. I think by the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt was not well at all. Everyone was really shocked when he flew into the Crimea for the Yalta Conference, when they saw him pale, haggard, clearly sick. In fact, of course, he was dying, would be dead within a few months. And I think that both him and indeed Churchill were really under par at the Yalta Conference, which is another reason why Stalin was so successful.
You think Churchill did a reasonable job with a poor hand? Britain was certainly by the end of the war, very much a junior partner to America, really dependent to a large extent on American military aid and financial support. Do you think he kind of nobody could have done better than he did in that scenario?
Churchill wrote a very wistful memo at one point. I think it was actually after the Tehran conference, which is at the tail end of 1943. He realized that Britain's power was draining away on the world stage. And he actually wrote, "Here I am. I find myself sitting between the great Russian bear with its paws outstretched and the mighty American buffalo. And here am I, the poor little English donkey."
Oh,
And I think in that phrase, it sort of encapsulates everything that he knows. And one of the reasons why he's so desperate to cling on to the empire is, it's all that's left of this last vestige of British power, which I think even Churchill sees is slipping away, and that the empire is doomed. And he's very wistful about it and very upset.
So do you think there are lessons for modern diplomats and world leaders in what you've written and what you've discovered? Or do we live in such a very different world now that these kind of personal, managed relationships are never going to be as important again?
No, I think they are incredibly important. And actually, one thing that I would say that I learned from both the diplomats, both from this book and actually my previous book, which was Checkmate in Berlin, which was a story of the very beginnings of the Cold War, is how do you deal with a brutal Russian ruler? And both the Americans and Brits had put a lot of thought into this. And these were people who knew Stalin well, who'd been there on the ground. They had great experience. People like George Kennan, who wrote a famous American diplomat based in Moscow, who wrote his, long telegram about how to deal with the Russians. And if you're winding forward to now what's happening in Ukraine with Putin, and it should be said, Putin, who's re-erecting Stalin statues all over Russia at the moment, which is pretty shocking. These diplomats, so notably notably George Kennan, but then you have people like Colonel Frank Howley, who was the American commandant in Berlin at the time when Stalin was blockading Berlin. He said there is only, and Kennan said that the Russians, they never understand the logic of reason. They only understand the logic of force. And so he and Colonel Howley, they would argue that in a situation that we're faced with now in the Ukraine, that force is the only option, that Russia has to be pushed back. And I know that these guys, long dead now, would be insisting on Western arms supplies being ramped up and giving Ukraine absolutely everything they need.
Well, amen to that. And yeah, that is a very good message to take, because I think there just, isn't there a phrase, was it Lenin, was it Stalin? I will push until I meet metal.
Yes, well, yeah, and Putin could have said exactly the same thing.
Oh, well, with that happy thought, let me thank you for taking half an hour out of the last final lingering days of your lovely summer holiday.
It's a great pleasure to join you again. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure for me too. And actually, you mentioned the Berlin book, Checkmaker Berlin, which is another cracking read. Really brings history to life in such an exciting way. Maybe one day you can come back and talk about that.
I'd love to. Thank you very much.
All the best. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Well, what a great conversation. Giles is such a nice guy and a terrific storyteller. You can tell just from the way he talks about stories that he writes them really well too, which he does. And actually, he's offered on an email to take a look at my book when it's ready, which it nearly is. And if he likes it, who knows, he maybe will give me a little endorsement, because that's what we writers live for. It's validation. Podcasters too. But no, he's a great mate, and I'm very pleased to have him on the podcast. And I've been making new contacts. I've got a few names, actually. People are going to come on to talk about really interesting things. I mentioned earlier, a couple of weeks ago, I want to do more sort of literary subjects as well as the traditional ones. So I've Madeline Potter, who studies the Gothic imagination, and she's a great expert on the background to all those classic stories like Frankenstein and Vampire, and how they emerged from that sort of circle of people around Lord Byron, who was an extremely scandalous character himself. So that should be great fun. Looking forward to that. Dr. Sarah Lodge is writing about women detectives of the Victorian era and the world the scandalous world indeed that they inhabited. So she's going to come on. Simon Heffer's coming on, great British writer, to talk about the abdication crisis. And I'm really excited. I mentioned this. I'm now talking to the publishers of Ask Not. Several of you have said this in the comments. It's a new book about the Kennedys. It takes a really tough-minded approach to the family. I mean, the subtitle is The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. And we've known for a long time that Jack Kennedy especially was a notorious womanizer, but so was his father. And it wasn't just womanizing in the sense of, they had a crazy sex life and he was, always having affairs. It was more kind of dark. There's a darker side to this. In the family itself, I think many of you will know what happened to his sister, but also in the women they encountered through their lives. And they come across as a family of predators in this book, I believe. So maybe that's only one side of the story. It'll be a very interesting one to talk to the author. It's Maureen Callahan. Hoping she'll be on soon as well. Oh, and I'm thinking of experimenting with a guest host. It's a little bit lonely by myself without the back and forth with Andrew. So now and again, I'm going to have a guest host. And if you remember, right at the beginning of the podcast, wonderful Mock O'Keefe came on to talk about Oscar Wilde. And it was so interesting. And he's got lots more things to say. And I think he's going to do a show with me, see how it goes, perhaps in a few weeks. Maybe the one about the Gothic imagination, actually. I bet he's got some interesting things to say about Lord Byron and his scandalous circle of friends and lovers. So that'll be fun. I'm not quite sure what next week's will be. I think it might be American politics, because I had a really interesting conversation with my friend Nick Bryant in Australia, who had been BBC's correspondent in America. And with all the election excitement building and that amazing debate between Trump and Kamala Harris the other day, I think we'll put that one out next week. But who knows? Scandalous things could happen. I can react to them as I have in the past. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please keep liking and subscribing. All the comments are read. I try to respond to them all as well. It's a great privilege to have your attention. Don't take it for granted. at all. So please continue to engage. And if you're feeling generous, you can even click on the thank you button and buy me a coffee or something. I mean, these 4 poster beds, they're not cheap. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.